When the religious talk about Jesus, which Jesus do they mean? The man God that did miracles and rose from the dead as described in the Bible, or the potentially real person or persons upon whom all of the later mythology was posthumously draped? Because they seem confused, like these two are one and the same thing. So let's talk about it. This has been a problem for a long time, and I've talked about it in passing in a couple of videos that I remember. But I keep coming across theists who seem to think that evidence in support of a potentially real person or persons that might have existed and were the kernel of the myth, that's the same thing as proving their demi-deity. And sorry, that's not how this works. They are not the same entity if either of them were ever real to begin with. All the wishful thinking in the world doesn't make Magic Man Jesus spring into existence. You actually have to prove it, and the religious don't even try. See, I keep getting the religious saying, well, there is evidence for Jesus. Even secular historians think so. Well, no, not so much. At best, secular historians may accept the likely existence of a Jesus analog, someone who was real and who may have preached in Palestine and who attracted a following, but who was not actually supernatural. And it's possible that there was such a person or persons who taught a message similar to the Jesus in the Bible, but who wasn't actually capable of doing miracles. He didn't rise from the dead, he didn't have a virgin birth, and he wasn't the son of any god. That's possible. It's not proven, but it's possible. There just isn't any actual evidence for such a person or persons in the historical record. They didn't leave behind any physical clues to their existence. They didn't leave behind any actual writings about what they taught. We don't know where they might have come from, and we don't know where they might have gone. They are a complete historical enigma. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't real. It only means that we have no ability at present of verifying that they were. It's all hearsay and conjecture. We just don't know for sure. But if that's what you mean when you say Jesus, then sure. For the sake of argument, I'll say that it's reasonable to assume that a real human Jesus analog, or analogs in any case, could have existed who gave us a tiny bit of the Jesus story and upon whom all of the supernatural and imaginary elements were grafted later on. I'll go with that. I don't believe such a person was real, but neither do I believe that they were not. I have no evidence on either side to support or deny such a claim. And neither do you. Neither does anyone. I'm just not denying that it's possible. Hey, it might even be likely. But that's about as far as I'm going to go. But the religious aren't satisfied with that. They want to believe in the Magic Man Jesus that sits on the right hand of God the Father, and anything that they can pretend supports that belief, they're going to go with. And it doesn't work that way at all. In order to go from a real human Jesus to a real demigod Jesus, not only do you have to prove that the human analog was real, and they're nowhere close to doing that, but they have to further prove that all of the supernatural elements actually happened. And for that, they're not even in the same ballpark. They're not even in the same galaxy. And the second you bring up any of that, the religious get obsessive and irrational because I think they know that you can't get from here to there. And they don't care if it makes any rational sense because their beliefs are simply not rational. See, the religious are desperate to point to anything, no matter how tenuous, and scream, "See? See? We told you so." It's like pointing at a dinosaur bone and saying, "See? We told you that magical fire-breathing flying dragons were real." Except, as I keep saying, it just doesn't work that way. You can't just arbitrarily pick a conclusion that you find emotionally comforting and demand, without corroboratory evidence, that your conclusion is true. You have to go step by step and cross your T's and dot your I's. And they're not even making the attempt. They don't care about making the attempt. They don't care if their beliefs are supported by any rational objective evidence or not. If it can be twisted and rationalized into looking like support, if you don't think about it too hard and squint your eyes just right, then they're going to go with it because the truth just doesn't matter. It never has, and it never will. The fact is, we don't have any credible evidence for either of the potential Jesuses. The Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses, no matter what church tradition says. The amount of desperation that you find among the religious, which demand that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by the disciples with those names, it's really absurd. But we know that's not the case. None of the gospel writers identified themselves, and the names of the gospels were tacked on many, many years later. The only one who even speaks about himself as the writer is in the Gospel of John, where he refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. Well, that's not evidence, that's a claim. We know that the Gospel of Mark was written first by an anonymous author. Then Matthew and Luke were taken, partially from Mark and partially from a hypothetical Q document. Just about all secular scholars reject the idea that any real-life disciples or close associates of real-life disciples had anything at all to do with the Gospels. Because of this, none of the Gospels can be considered evidence for the existence of either of the possible Jesus candidates. They are stories, and we know that they drew from a wide array of prior religious sources for the stories and the miracles claimed about Jesus. Everything from walking on water to rising from the dead, all of those things came from pre-existing religious traditions that were well known before the idea of Jesus was ever proposed. They may have had different spins put on the myths, but the myths are certainly identifiable. This gives more credence to the idea that, yeah, there might have been a real person or persons at the core of what would later become the Jesus myth, but there's absolutely no reason to think that person or persons could do any of the things that the biblical Jesus is claimed to have been able to do. In fact, it's likely that whatever real Jesus analog there might have been, his story was probably mixed with Paul's entirely separate ideas about some kind of a magical Jesus man into a fusion that absolutely never existed at all. But if the Jesus as described in the Bible didn't exist, then all of Christianity falls apart. It's why Christians are so desperate to assume that any mention of Jesus at all automatically means that their mystical, magical man-god has to be real. It has to. Otherwise, their beliefs are empty, and they've just wasted their lives. It's why they spend so much time grasping at straws. Their very theological existence depends on it. They have to assume that everything, absolutely everything, points to a real biblical Jesus, just like they pretend that everything, absolutely everything, points to a real God somewhere in the sky, admitting that they have no rational reason to think that any of these things are real would serve a mortal blow to their emotionally held beliefs, and they simply can't have that. But that's the simple reality that we have. There isn't any good reason to think that Jesus, the Jesus described in the Bible, ever existed at all. If there was a real person or persons that served as the kernel of a later invented myth, that doesn't do a thing for Christianity. In fact, it makes it even more absurd. It just shows that the religious have been taken in by a millennia-long lie that they're not smart enough to tell the difference between a fairy tale and real life, and they will never be able to accept that. It's why, as people become more intelligent, educated, and rational, they drop religious beliefs like a red-hot frying pan. Those who care about reality tend not to believe in fantasy. They're not flat earthers. Those are almost wholly religious. They're not anti-vaxxers. Those, again, are almost wholly religious. They don't believe in astrology or fate. They don't buy into scams like The Secret or prosperity gospel bullshit. Rational people accept reality as it is, not as they wish it was. And as the Western world gets more and more educated, fewer and fewer people fall for religion. It's why it's dying. It's why the religious have to do whatever they can to gather the last few remaining believers and proclaim that they've really got it all right and everyone else has it all wrong. We scare them. Reality scares them. We are the future and they are the past. And for them, that's terrifying. So, the next time that someone tells you that Jesus was real, ask them which Jesus they mean. They have to get from a possible real analog to an absurdly mythical magic man god. They aren't the same thing. They never have been and they never will be. And maybe one day, we'll manage to get that through their tiny little heads. And won't that be a glorious day? Boom, dicky, 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 boom.